A young German woman stands at the altar in a small American church in January 1947, wearing a simple white dress. Her hands tremble slightly as she clutches a modest bouquet of winter flowers. Beside her stands a tall man in his Sunday best, his calloused farmer's hands gentle as he takes hers. The congregation watches in uneasy silence. Some faces show curiosity, others barely conceal disapproval. This is no ordinary wedding. 3 years ago, this woman wore the gray uniform of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps. 3 years ago, this man carried a rifle and stood watch over her behind barbed wire and guard towers. How did a prisoner of war become a bride? How did an enemy become a beloved? The answer begins not here, in this Kansas chapel, but across an ocean, in the smoke and thunder of a collapsing empire. France, June 1944. The earth itself seemed to scream. Allied bombers roared overhead in formations so vast they blotted out the summer sun. Artillery shells whistled through the air before exploding in geysers of dirt and fire. Annalisa Fischer crouched in a makeshift field hospital, her white nurse's apron splattered with blood that would never wash clean. At 22 years old, she had seen more death than most people witness in a lifetime. Around her, wounded German soldiers groaned on stretchers, their cries blending into a chorus of agony that had become as familiar as breathing. She had grown up in Stuttgart, a city of culture and industry nestled in the valleys of southwestern Germany. Her father had been a schoolteacher, her mother a seamstress. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until the war consumed everything. Annalise had been 17 when the Reich came calling, recruiting young women for auxiliary services. Nursing seemed noble, even necessary. Someone had to care for the wounded. Someone had to ease the suffering of boys barely older than herself, boys who cried for their mothers in the night. The training had been rigorous. She learned to tie tourniquets with shaking hands, to recognize the gray pallor of shock, to move efficiently through chaos. They taught her that she was serving the fatherland, that her work was essential to victory. But more than anything, they taught her to fear the enemy. The propaganda had been relentless. Posters plastered across hospital walls depicted Americans as savage brutes, as gangsters and criminals who cared nothing for honor or decency. Radio broadcasts warned that captured Germans would be tortured, starved, or worse. Female prisoners, the whispers went, faced horrors too terrible to name aloud. Annalisa had believed it all. Why wouldn't she? It was all she had ever known. In the sealed world of the Reich, truth was whatever the state declared it to be. And so when the Allied advance began after D-Day, when the sound of American voices grew closer each day, she felt not just fear, but absolute terror. The end came faster than anyone expected. The field hospital where she served sat just behind German lines near the Norman coast. In the early morning hours of a humid July day, American forces broke through. There was no dramatic battle, no heroic last stand, just exhaustion, confusion, and the sudden appearance of soldiers in different uniforms. Annalise was bandaging a private's shattered arm when she looked up and saw them. American infantry, rifles raised, moving cautiously through the tent. One of them shouted something in English she couldn't understand. Another gestured with his weapon. The meaning was clear enough. Hands up, you're captured. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. This was the moment she had dreaded. This was where the nightmares would begin. She raised her hands slowly, blood still wet on her fingers. The soldiers searched the tent, checking for weapons, securing the wounded. To her astonishment, they were calm, almost businesslike. One American medic even nodded respectfully at her medical supplies before moving on. No one struck her, no one screamed, no one did any of the terrible things she had been promised would happen. But the fear didn't leave. It simply transformed into confusion. They were loaded onto trucks, a mix of captured medical staff and wounded soldiers who could be moved. Annalisa sat pressed between two other nurses, both as silent and terrified as herself. The truck rumbled away from the front lines, through French villages where locals watched with hard eyes. Some spat, others turned away. She understood. To them, any German uniform was the uniform of an occupier. The truck convoy eventually reached a larger holding facility near the coast where hundreds of German prisoners were being processed. Here, for the first time, Annalise saw the scale of the defeat. Officers stripped of their insignia, enlisted men sitting in exhausted clusters, everyone waiting to learn their fate. The Americans fed them. That alone seemed impossible. Soup, bread, even coffee. Not much, but more than many had eaten in days. Annalise took her ration with trembling hands, half expecting it to be snatched away or revealed as some cruel joke. It wasn't. She ate slowly, tasting each bite, trying to understand what was happening. Days blurred together at the holding camp. They slept in tents under guard, were marched to latrines in groups, stood in lines for food and water. American soldiers watched them constantly but rarely spoke. Language was a wall between them. Sometimes a translator would appear, barking orders or asking questions. Mostly, though, there was just waiting and wondering. Then came the ships. In late August, Annalise and several hundred other prisoners were marched to the docks. Before them loomed massive transport vessels, gray and imposing against the pale sky. Liberty ships, someone said, built by the Americans in their factories across the ocean. Annalise stared up at the hull and felt her stomach twist. She had never been on a ship before. She had never left Europe. And now she was being sent to America itself, the heart of enemy territory. The crossing took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of misery in the cramped holds below deck, where prisoners were packed into bunks stacked 3 high. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of seasickness and unwashed bodies. The ship rolled constantly on the Atlantic swells, making sleep nearly impossible. Annalise spent most of the voyage clutching her bunk frame, trying not to vomit, trying not to think about what awaited her on the other shore. Some prisoners talked quietly in the darkness. They traded rumors and fears. America was enormous, they said. It had never been bombed. Its cities still stood intact while Europe crumbled. Some whispered that prisoners would be sent to work camps in deserts or frozen wastelands. Others insisted they would simply be executed upon arrival. Annalise listened and said nothing. She had no answers, only the same gnawing dread that seemed to live in her chest now. One night, about halfway across, an older nurse named Hilda spoke up from the bunk beside her. Hilda was perhaps 35, a veteran who had served in field hospitals since Poland. She had seen everything, survived everything. In the darkness, her voice was steady. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we survive. That's what we do. We survive." Annalise wanted to believe her. When the ship finally reached New York Harbor in early September 1944, Annalise pressed her face to a porthole and stared. She had expected destruction, or at least signs of hardship. Instead, she saw a city blazing with lights. Skyscrapers rose like mountains of glass and steel, untouched by war. The Statue of Liberty stood green and proud in the harbor, her torch raised high. Ships moved everywhere, a vast maritime ballet of commerce and military power. The sheer scale of it all was crushing. This nation had not been touched by the war that had devastated Europe. It had the wealth and strength to build ships, feed prisoners, and still stand gleaming and whole. The propaganda had lied. America was not weak. It was not crumbling. It was a giant that had barely stirred, and it had crushed the Reich without even bleeding at home. They disembarked under heavy guard and were marched into a processing facility. Camp Shanks, someone said, a staging area where prisoners were cataloged, questioned, and assigned to their final destinations. Annalise shuffled through the lines, answering questions through translators: name, rank, service record, medical training. She answered mechanically, too exhausted to feel much of anything anymore. But she noticed things, small things that didn't fit the image she had carried. American soldiers offered water without being asked. Medical staff checked the prisoners for illness and actually treated what they found. No one was beaten. No one was starved. The guards looked bored, more than cruel, watching the prisoners with the same weary indifference one might give to any tedious duty. After 3 days at Camp Shanks, Annalise and a group of other female prisoners were loaded onto a train. This time, there were no explanations, just orders. The train pulled away from New York and headed west. For days, they traveled through a landscape that seemed impossible. Fields stretched to the horizon, vast and golden with late summer harvest. Towns passed by with neat houses and full store windows. Factories hummed with activity. Everywhere she looked, Annalisa saw abundance. Cattle grazed in enormous herds. Grain silos rose like towers. The wealth was casual, effortless, woven into the very fabric of the land. In Germany, people were starving. Cities were rubble. The countryside was scarred by years of war. Here, America looked like it was hosting a picnic, while Europe tore itself apart. The train carried them south and west, through states whose names meant nothing to her: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri, Kansas. Finally, the landscape changed. The fields gave way to something drier, harder. Desert scrub and distant mountains appeared on the horizon. They were entering the American Southwest, though Annalise had no idea what that meant. After nearly a week of travel, the train finally stopped in a small Arizona town. The prisoners were unloaded and loaded once more onto trucks. The sun was merciless here, a white-hot hammer that beat down from a cloudless sky. The air was dry and thin, so different from the damp forests of Germany. Annalisa squinted against the brightness and saw, in the distance, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by fences. Camp Florence, a prisoner of war camp in the Arizona desert. This would be her home for however long the war lasted, or however long she lasted. As the truck rumbled toward the gates, Annalise felt the fear return. The journey had been bewildering, but now came the reality of captivity. She would be behind barbed wire, guarded by enemies, cut off from everything she had ever known. Her family in Stuttgart might be dead for all she knew. Her country was losing the war. Her entire world had collapsed, and here she was, in a desert on the far side of the earth, about to enter a prison camp. The truck stopped. Guards shouted orders. The prisoners climbed down, stiff and aching from the journey. Annalise took her first steps onto Arizona soil and looked around. The camp was smaller than she expected. Neat rows of barracks, a few guard towers, fences but not the towering walls she had imagined. American soldiers stood watching, rifles slung over shoulders. One guard in particular caught her eye. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and light brown hair. Young, maybe 25. He leaned casually against a post near the gate, watching the new arrivals with mild curiosity. When his eyes met hers for just a moment, she saw no hatred there, no cruelty, just a calm, almost thoughtful gaze. Then he looked away, and the moment passed. Annalise filed into the camp with the others, was assigned a bunk in one of the women's barracks, and received her first meal as an official prisoner of war. Bread, soup, coffee, simple but sufficient. She ate in silence, surrounded by the quiet murmur of other women trying to make sense of their new reality. That night, lying on a thin mattress under a scratchy blanket, Annalisa stared at the ceiling and wondered what came next. She had survived the capture, the crossing, the journey. Now came something else, something she couldn't yet name. All she knew was that she was alive, in a strange land, surrounded by enemies who had not yet proven themselves monsters. And somewhere outside, walking the perimeter of the camp under the stars, was a young American guard who would change her life forever. She would learn his name 3 weeks later. For now, he was just the tall guard with the slight limp who walked the fence line every morning at dawn. Annalise noticed him because he moved differently than the other soldiers. Most guards marched with rigid military precision, rifles held tight, eyes scanning for trouble that never came. This one walked slowly, favoring his left leg just enough to create an uneven rhythm. Sometimes he stopped to look at the mountains in the distance or to watch the sun paint the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. He seemed less like a soldier and more like someone serving time himself, just on the other side of the wire. Camp Florence sprawled across the flat Arizona desert like a small temporary city. The main compound held male prisoners, several thousand German soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy. But tucked into the northeast corner, separated by an additional fence and its own set of barracks, was the women's section. Roughly 200 female prisoners lived here. Nurses mostly, like Annalise, but also clerks, telephone operators, and other auxiliary personnel captured as the Wehrmacht crumbled. The American military hadn't quite known what to do with them at first. Women prisoners were rare, unexpected. So they created this separate world within a world, guarded but also strangely protected. The barracks were simple wooden structures, each housing about 30 women in double-stacked bunks. The buildings were new, built hastily but solidly, with screened windows that let in the desert breeze. Each morning at 6, a bell rang. The women rose, washed at communal sinks, dressed in the plain work clothes provided by the camp, and lined up for roll call. Then came breakfast in the mess hall. Oatmeal or grits, bread, sometimes eggs, always coffee. The food was plain but plentiful, more than Annalise had seen in the final year of the war in Europe. After breakfast came work assignments. The camp operated on the principle that idle prisoners caused problems, so everyone worked. Some women cleaned the barracks or helped in the kitchens. Others mended uniforms or sorted supplies. Annalise, because of her medical training, was assigned to the camp infirmary. It was a small clinic staffed by an American Army doctor and 2 medics, treating everything from heat exhaustion to infected cuts to the occasional broken bone. The work was familiar, almost comforting. Medicine spoke a universal language. A wound was a wound, regardless of which uniform you wore. The days fell into a rhythm. Morning roll call, breakfast, work, lunch, more work, dinner, evening free time in the recreation hall where women gathered to read, write letters, or listen to the radio. Lights out at 10. The routine was numbing but also safe. It kept the mind occupied, kept the darker thoughts at bay. The guards maintained a careful distance. They watched, they counted, they escorted prisoners when necessary, but they rarely engaged. Fraternization was strictly forbidden. The Army had made that clear. These were enemy nationals, prisoners of war, not neighbors or friends. The Germans kept to themselves as well. Pride demanded it. They had been soldiers of the Reich, and even in defeat, they carried themselves with a certain dignity. But the tall guard with the limp seemed to operate by slightly different rules. Annalise first spoke to him on a morning in late September. She had been at the camp for 3 weeks, long enough for the initial shock to fade into a kind of resigned acceptance. She was walking from the barracks to the infirmary when she stumbled on the uneven ground and dropped the small medical kit she was carrying. Bandages and supplies scattered across the dust. She knelt quickly to gather them, embarrassed, aware that several guards were watching from their posts. Then a shadow fell across her, and a hand appeared holding one of the rolled bandages. She looked up. It was him, the tall guard. Up close she could see he had hazel eyes and a sunburned nose. He smiled, just a slight quirk of his mouth, and said something in English she didn't understand. He gestured at the supplies, then helped her pick up the rest without waiting for permission. "Thank you," she said in German, knowing he wouldn't understand but feeling the need to say something. He nodded, handed her the last of the bandages, and walked away without another word. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but something about it stuck with her. The casual kindness, the lack of hostility, the smile. His name was James Anderson, Jim to everyone who knew him. He was 25 years old, born and raised on a wheat farm outside a tiny Kansas town called Hayes. He had 3 younger sisters, parents who had worked the same land for 30 years, and a childhood spent learning the rhythms of planting and harvest. When the war began, Jim had tried to enlist immediately. Defending the country felt like the right thing to do, the necessary thing. But the Army doctors had other ideas. At 17, Jim had been kicked by a horse while bringing in the harvest. The injury had shattered his left knee. It healed more or less, but it left him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. The Army rejected him for combat duty. He appealed twice. Both times, the answer was the same. "You can't march 50 miles with a full pack on that leg, son. We need soldiers who can." It had felt like shame, like weakness. All his friends went off to fight while he stayed home on the farm. Finally, in desperation, he reapplied for limited service. Guard duty, stateside posts, anything to wear the uniform. The Army accepted. In the summer of 1943, Jim became Corporal Anderson, assigned to prisoner of war camp detail. It wasn't the heroism he had imagined, but it was service. It counted. He had been at Camp Florence for 8 months when the first female prisoners arrived. The guards had been briefed. Maintain discipline, no fraternization, treat them fairly but firmly. These were enemy nationals trained by the Nazi regime, and caution was essential. Jim had nodded along with the others, but privately he felt uneasy. When the trucks arrived and he saw the women climb down, exhausted and frightened, they didn't look like dangerous enemies. They looked like his sisters, tired farm girls far from home. The stumbling incident with the dark-haired nurse was nothing special. She dropped something. He helped. Simple courtesy. But he noticed her after that. She moved with efficiency, always heading to the infirmary with purpose. She had a serious face, rarely smiled, and kept her eyes down when guards passed. He learned from the camp records that her name was Anneliese Fischer, 22 years old, nurse, captured in France, from Stuttgart. Beyond that, she was just another prisoner among hundreds, except she wasn't. Not to him. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the quiet sadness he saw in her face. Maybe it was the way she cared for the other prisoners in the infirmary with such gentle patience. Maybe it was just loneliness, the desert isolation working on him. Whatever it was, Jim found himself noticing when she walked to breakfast, when she sat reading in the recreation hall, when she stood during roll call looking small and lost. He started finding excuses to walk past the infirmary, checking the perimeter, inspecting the fence line, delivering messages that could have been delivered by anyone. Sometimes he saw her through the window, changing bandages or organizing supplies. Once their eyes met through the screen. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw the flicker of recognition. The first real conversation happened in October. Anneliese was working in the infirmary when an American medic asked her to carry some supplies to the storage shed outside. It was a simple task, but she had to cross the open yard and the sun was brutal. She was halfway there when she felt dizzy, the heat and exhaustion catching up. She paused, swaying slightly. Jim saw it from his post. Yunchet moved quickly, catching her elbow as she stumbled. "Whoa, easy. You okay?" She looked at him, confused by the English words, but understanding the concern. "I am fine," she said in heavily accented English, one of the few phrases she had learned. "Thank you." "You speak English?" he asked, surprised. "A little?" "Very little." She struggled for words. "Hot. Very hot." "Yeah, Arizona will do that. Come on, let's get you in the shade." He guided her to the narrow strip of shadow along the barracks wall. "Sit down a minute. Catch your breath." She sat, grateful, and he crouched beside her, his bad knee making the motion awkward. He pulled a canteen from his belt and offered it. "Water. Drink." She hesitated. The rules against fraternization were clear. Accepting personal favors from guards crossed a line, but her throat was parched, and the gesture seemed so simple, so human. She took the canteen and drank. The water was warm but clean. She handed it back. "Thank you." "Again, thank you. No problem." He studied her face, the flush of heat exhaustion fading. "You work in the infirmary, right? You're a nurse?" "Yes, nurse." She nodded, then added slowly, "I help the sick. That's good work. Important." He smiled. "My mom's a nurse, back home in Kansas." "Kansas?" She didn't know the word. "It's a state in the middle of the country. Lots of wheat, flat land." He gestured with his hands, trying to make her understand. "Very different from here." She nodded, though she only half understood. The conversation was clumsy, broken, but it was a conversation. The first real one she'd had with an American. When she felt steady enough, she stood. Jim stood with her, wincing slightly as his knee protested. "Your leg," she said, noticing the limp again. "It hurts?" "Old injury. Horse kicked me. It's fine. I'm sorry." She meant it. Even across the language barrier, even across the divide of uniform and nation, she could recognize pain. He shrugged. "Could be worse. At least I can still walk. Some guys can't." He paused, then added, "You should get back inside, out of the heat." "Yes. Thank you, Corporal." She hesitated, then said carefully, "You were kind." Jim watched her walk back to the infirmary, and something shifted in his chest. She'd called him kind. The word carried weight, recognition, maybe even trust. From that day forward, the ice began to thaw. It happened slowly, in fragments and stolen moments. Jim started bringing English language books to the infirmary, leaving them on the windowsill with a note that said, "For practice." Anneliese found them and began reading, stumbling through the words with a dictionary borrowed from the camp library. She left thank you notes in return, written in careful English with German corrections in the margins. He taught her phrases during his rounds. "Good morning. How are you? The weather is nice today." She repeated them back, her accent thick but her determination clear. He learned a few German words from her. Danke, bitte, Guten Tag, there. Conversations were brief, always professional, always in places where other guards or prisoners could see. But they were conversations. Bridges built word by word. Annaliese's work in the infirmary brought them into contact more often. When guards needed medical attention for minor injuries, she was sometimes the one to treat them. Jim came in once with a badly blistered hand from repairing fence wire in the sun. She cleaned and bandaged it with the same efficient care she gave everyone, but her touch was gentle, and she met his eyes when she said, "You must be careful." He nodded, unable to look away. The other prisoners noticed. Hilda, the older nurse who had comforted Anneliese on the ship, pulled her aside one evening. "Be careful with that guard," she warned in German. "People are watching. It's dangerous." "There's nothing to be careful about," Anneliese replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "We just talk. He helps me learn English. Men don't help for nothing, and even if his intentions are good, the rules are clear. Fraternization can get you both in trouble. Maybe worse." Anneliese knew Hilda was right, but she also knew that her conversations with Jim were the only light in the monotony of captivity. He made her feel human again, not a prisoner, not an enemy, just a person. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. The guards noticed too. Another corporal, a hard-eyed man named Stevens, cornered Jim one afternoon near the motor pool. "You're spending a lot of time around the German nurse," he said flatly. "That smart?" "I'm doing my job," Jim replied evenly. "Your job doesn't include English lessons and book deliveries. Fraternization's against regs, Anderson. You know that. I'm not fraternizing. I'm being decent. There's a difference." Stevens snorted. "To the brass, there's no difference. You're playing with fire. And if it burns you, don't expect sympathy." Jim didn't respond. He just walked away, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He knew Stevens was right about the rules, but he also knew that rules written thousands of miles away by men who had never seen these prisoners, never talked to them, felt increasingly hollow. As autumn turned toward winter, the desert cooled, and life in the camp settled into its rhythms. Thanksgiving came. The American Guard celebrated with turkey and football games on the radio. The German prisoners were given a special meal as well, a gesture of adherence to the Geneva Conventions. Annalise sat in the mess hall, eating roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, listening to the other women talk about home. Christmas was coming. None of them knew if they would ever see Germany again. Jim found her that evening, sitting alone near the fence, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mind if I sit?" She glanced up, surprised. It was bold, sitting together like this. But the yard was empty, and the guard towers were far enough. Away. She nodded. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance. "You okay?" he asked. "I think of home," she said quietly. "My family, Stuttgart. I do not know if they live. I'm sorry." He meant it. That must be hard, not knowing. Yes, very hard. She wrapped her arms around herself. This war, it takes everything. They sat in silence for a while. Then Jim said, "You know, my dad fought in the last war, World War I. He was in France, saw terrible things. He came home different, quieter. He told me once that the worst part wasn't the fighting. It was coming home and realizing the world had moved on without him." Annalise looked at him. "Your father, he is well now?" "He's all right. It took time. But he healed, mostly." Jim paused, then added, "What I mean is, even after something terrible, people can heal, build new lives. It's possible." "I hope this," she said softly. "I hope for healing." He looked at her, and for a moment, the war, the fences, the uniforms, all of it faded. There was just a young man and a young woman, both far from home, both trying to make sense of a broken world. Jim wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to offer comfort beyond words. But he didn't. The line was already blurred enough. Instead, he stood. "I should go. Night watch starts soon." "Yes?" She stood as well. "Thank you, Jim, for talking." It was the first time she had used his name. He smiled. "Anytime, Annalisa." As he walked away, she felt something shift inside her, something dangerous and confusing. She was falling for him, for the enemy, for the guard who watched over her captivity. It was impossible. It was forbidden. And yet, it was happening. Inside the barracks that night, lying in her bunk, Annalise stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of guilt press down. What would her family think? What would her fellow prisoners say? What kind of person developed feelings for their captor? But then she remembered his kindness, his patience, the way he looked at her like she mattered, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, something good could grow even in the soil of war. The thing about hope is that it dies slowly, piece by piece, until one day you wake up and realize it's gone. By the spring of 1945, most of the German prisoners at Camp Florence had stopped hoping for victory. The news that filtered through the camp, carried by newspapers and radio broadcasts the guards allowed them to hear, painted an undeniable picture. Germany was collapsing. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was crumbling after just 12. Soviet forces were pushing from the east. American and British armies drove from the west. The fatherland was being crushed between two unstoppable forces. Annalisa listened to the news with a numbness that had become familiar. Part of her felt relief. The killing would stop. The madness would end. But another part, the part that remembered her home and her family, felt only dread. What was happening to Stuttgart? Were her parents alive? Her younger brother who had been conscripted at 17? Her sister who had written letters about ration cards and air raids until the letters stopped coming? Jim saw the strain on her face during those weeks. Their conversations had become regular now, almost routine. He no longer pretended to have official reasons for stopping by the infirmary. She no longer pretended not to watch for him during her breaks. The other prisoners whispered. The guards noticed, but neither of them stopped. In a world defined by uncertainty, their brief moments together had become the only constant. On the 8th of May, 1945, the news arrived. Germany had surrendered, unconditional surrender to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. The camp erupted in chaos. American guards cheered and embraced. Someone fired shots into the air in celebration. The radio in the administration building blared victory music. For the Americans, it was vindication, triumph, the end of a long struggle. For the German prisoners, it was something else entirely. The war was over. They had lost everything. In the women's barracks, the mood was funereal. Some women wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. A few tried to maintain dignity, standing straight and stone-faced, refusing to show emotion, but everyone felt it, the weight of total defeat. Annalisa sat on her bunk, hands folded in her lap, and tried to process what this meant. The fighting was over. That was good. Men would stop dying. Cities would stop burning. But Germany itself was in ruins. Everything she had known was gone, and she had no idea if anyone she loved had survived to see this day. That evening, Jim found her sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at nothing. He approached carefully, aware that this was a delicate moment. The other guards were still celebrating, their voices carrying across the compound. He sat down beside her without asking permission. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Annalisa said quietly, "It is finished. All of it." Her English had improved dramatically over the months. She still made mistakes, but she could express herself now, communicate real thoughts. "Yes," Jim said, "it's finished. My country is destroyed. My family I do not know. Everything is gone." Her voice cracked slightly, but she held herself together. "I should feel happy. The war is over. But I feel only empty." Jim wanted to comfort her, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he said, "You'll go home soon. The army will start sending prisoners back. You'll find your family. You'll rebuild." "Will I?" She turned to look at him, and her eyes were dark with pain. "What if there is nothing to go home to? What if they are all dead? What if Stuttgart is only rubble and graves? Then you'll survive anyway. You're strong, Annalisa, stronger than you know." He hesitated, then added softly, "You survive this. You'll survive what comes next." She wanted to believe him, but belief required hope, and hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said, "for being kind, for making this easier." There was something in the way she said it, a finality, a goodbye. Jim felt panic rise in his chest. "Wait," he said, "before you go back, before they send you home. There's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, waiting. He took a breath. This was it, the moment he either said what needed to be said or lost his chance forever. "I know the rules. I know this isn't allowed. I know people will judge and talk and think I'm crazy, but I don't care. These past months, getting to know you, talking with you, it's meant everything to me. You're not just a prisoner. You're not just someone I guard. You're the person I think about when I wake up and the last person I think about before I sleep. I care about you, Annalisa. More than I should. More than is probably smart. But I do." Annalisa stared at him, her heart hammering. She had suspected, hoped even. But hearing him say it aloud made it real and terrifying. "Jim," she whispered, "this is impossible." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I know it's impossible. You're German. I'm American. You're a prisoner. I'm a guard. The army would court-martial me if they knew I was even saying this, but I had to tell you. Before you leave. Before I never see you again. I had to tell you that you matter to me." Tears welled in her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "You matter to me also. You have made this bearable. You have been a friend when I had none. But what can we do? I must return to Germany. You must stay here. We are from different worlds. Maybe we are, but maybe that doesn't have to be the end." He leaned forward, urgent now. "When you go back, when you find your family and figure out what comes next, think about this. Think about me. I'll wait. I'll figure out a way. There's got to be some legal path, some way for you to come back if you want to. I'll find it." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "Jim, you do not understand. In Germany, they will call me a traitor for caring about an American. Here, people will hate me for being German. Your family, your friends, they will not accept this. Let me worry about that." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched beyond professional necessity, and the contact sent electricity through both of them. "Just promise me you'll think about it. Promise me you won't forget." Annalise looked down at their joined hands. This was madness. This violated every rule, every expectation, and yet, holding his hand felt like the only sane thing in an insane world. "I promise," she said finally. "I will think about it. I will not forget." They sat there together, as the sun set over the desert, two people from opposite sides of a war, holding hands and hoping for something neither of them could name. The repatriation process began in late summer of 1945, but it moved slowly. Millions of displaced people needed to be sorted, processed, and transported. German prisoners were low priority. The army focused first on Allied POWs liberated from German camps, then on refugees and civilians. The Camp Florence prisoners waited through summer and into fall, their lives suspended in bureaucratic limbo. Jim used the time. He wrote letters to military administrators asking about regulations regarding marriages between American servicemen and enemy nationals. The responses were discouraging. Fraternization remained forbidden. Marriages required special permission that was rarely granted. Former enemies could not simply immigrate to the United States. The legal barriers were enormous. But Jim was a farmer's son. He knew about patience, about working the land slowly, season by season, until the harvest came. He saved every dollar of his pay. He wrote to his parents, preparing them for a conversation that would be difficult, but necessary. He researched immigration law and marriage regulations until he understood the maze he would have to navigate. Annalisa, meanwhile, tried to prepare herself for return. Letters from Germany had started arriving, delayed by months, filled with horror stories. Stuttgart had been bombed repeatedly. The old city center was gone. Housing was scarce. Food was rationed. Refugees flooded the streets. She had received one letter from a neighbor confirming that her parents were alive, but their house had been destroyed. They were living in a temporary shelter. Her brother's status was unknown. Her sister had fled to the countryside. The news should have made her eager to return, to find them, to help. Instead, She felt torn. She wanted to see her family desperately, but she also knew that leaving America meant leaving Jim, and that thought hurt more than she wanted to admit. In December of 1945, the orders came. Annalise and a group of other female prisoners would ship out in January. Final repatriation, return to Germany, the end of captivity. Jim found her the night before she left. They met behind the infirmary, out of sight of the guard towers, risking everything for a few stolen minutes. He held her close, and she let herself cry into his shoulder. "I do not want to go," she admitted. "I know I must, but I do not want to. I don't want you to go either." His voice was rough. "But you have to find your family. You have to see what's left. You have to try to rebuild. I understand that." She pulled back to look at him. "Oh, will you wait?" "Truly?" "I'll wait," he said firmly. "However long it takes, I'll figure this out. I'll find a way. Just don't give up on us. I will not give up," she promised. "Write to me. The address, I will give it to you. Write, and I will answer." They kissed then, for the first and last time before her departure. It was brief and desperate, and filled with all the things they couldn't say. When they pulled apart, both had tears on their faces. The next morning, Annalisa boarded a Dadit's truck with dozens of other women. Jim stood at attention with the other guards as the convoy pulled away. Their eyes met one last time. She pressed her palm against the truck's window. He touched his chest, over his heart. Then the truck turned a corner, and he was gone. The journey back across the Atlantic was just as miserable as the first crossing, but Annalise barely noticed. She was leaving behind a prison camp and the only man who had ever made her feel truly seen. The irony was crushing. When she had arrived in America, she had been terrified. Now, leaving, she was heartbroken. Germany in January of 1946 was a nightmare made real. The ship docked in Bremen, which was barely recognizable as a city. Rubble lined the streets. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed. Annalise and the other returning prisoners were processed quickly and given train vouchers to their home cities. The train to Stuttgart took 2 days, delayed by damaged tracks and fuel shortages. When she finally arrived, Annalisa stood on the platform and stared in disbelief. Stuttgart, the beautiful city of her childhood, was gone. In its place was a wasteland. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened. The streets she had walked to school, the parks where she had played, the shops where her mother had bought fabric, all of it was rubble and ash. She found her parents in a refugee shelter on the city's outskirts. They were alive, but aged beyond recognition. Her father, once a proud schoolteacher, was gaunt and stooped. Her mother wept when she saw Annalise, clutching her daughter as if she might vanish. They had lost everything: their home, their possessions, their savings. They survived on Red Cross rations and the charity of churches. Her brother was dead, killed in the final weeks of the war, defending Berlin in a battle that meant nothing. Her sister had married a farmer and lived 2 days' journey away. The family was scattered, broken, barely surviving. Annalise threw herself into helping them. She found work as a nurse in one of the makeshift hospitals treating wounded soldiers and sick civilians. The pay was almost nothing, but it was something. She stood in ration lines. She bartered for food. She helped her parents navigate the chaos of rebuilding. But at night, lying on a cot in the crowded shelter, she thought of Jim. She wondered if he remembered her, if he had meant what he said, if he would really wait. 6 weeks after her return, the first letter arrived. It had been delayed, passed through military censors, stamped and re-stamped, but it was from him. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Dear Annalisa," it began, "I hope this reaches you. I hope you're safe and that you found your family alive. I think about you every day. I haven't stopped. I won't stop. I'm working on a way for us to be together. It's complicated, but I'm not giving up. Please write back. Tell me you're okay. Tell me you remember. Love, Jim." She read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face. He had waited. He was trying. She wrote back immediately, pouring out everything: the devastation of Germany, the condition of her family, her work, and most importantly, her feelings. "I remember," she wrote. "I remember everything. I think of you also, always." The letters became their lifeline. Jim wrote every week, sometimes twice. He told her about Kansas, about his family, about the farm. He told her he had been discharged from the Army but was still working on the legal problems. He had contacted lawyers, immigration officials, anyone who might help. He told her he loved her, plainly, repeatedly, without shame. Annalise wrote back with equal devotion. She told him about the slow rebuilding of Germany, about her patience, about small moments of hope. She told him she loved him too, that the months apart had not diminished her feelings, but strengthened them. In May of 1946, a year after the war ended, Jim's letter arrived with a question that changed everything. Annalise, will you marry me? I know it's crazy. I know it's difficult. But I found a way. The War Brides Act, they're expanding it. It might include German nationals eventually. Even if it doesn't, I'll find another path. But I need to know. Will you come back to America? Will you be my wife? Please say yes. Annalise sat with the letter for hours. This was the impossible choice. Stay in Germany, help her parents rebuild, honor her duty to her homeland, or go back to America, to a man who loved her, to a future that felt both terrifying and full of promise. She thought of her father's words when she had told him about Jim. He had been shocked at first, then thoughtful. You must choose life, he had said finally. We will survive here. But you have a chance at happiness. Do not throw it away out of guilt. That night, Annalise wrote her answer. Yes, she wrote. Yes, I will marry you. I will come back. I choose you. I choose us. I choose life. She mailed the letter the next morning and waited, heart full of fear and hope, for whatever came next. The bureaucracy moved with all the speed of a glacier. Jim's proposal arrived in May of 1946, and Annalise's acceptance went back across the Atlantic within days. But saying yes was the easy part. Actually making it happen required navigating a maze of regulations that seemed designed to prevent exactly what they were trying to do. The War Brides Act, passed by the United States Congress in December of 1945, had been created to help American servicemen bring home the foreign women they had married during the war. British wives, French wives, even Italian wives were being processed and welcomed. But German women presented a complication. They were former enemy nationals. The wounds of war were too fresh, the prejudices too strong. Jim threw himself into the battle with the same determination he had once applied to fixing fence lines in the Arizona heat. He wrote letters to congressmen, to military administrators, to immigration officials. He hired a lawyer in Kansas City who specialized in immigration law. The lawyer was blunt. This is going to be difficult, he said. German nationals are explicitly excluded from most immigration pathways right now. Your best chance is to wait for amendments to the War Brides Act or to prove exceptional circumstances. What kind of exceptional circumstances? Jim asked. The kind that show she's not a security risk, that she was never a committed Nazi, that she has rehabilitation potential. The lawyer paused. And you need to be prepared for rejection. And for judgment. People won't understand this. I don't care if they understand, Jim said flatly. I just need it to be legal. In Germany, Annalise faced her own battles. The paperwork required was staggering. Affidavits proving she had never been a member of the Nazi Party. Medical examinations, background checks, character references, interviews with Allied occupation authorities who looked at her with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. One British officer asked her point blank, "Why would an American want to marry you? What did you do to manipulate him?" She had kept her composure, answering each question with quiet dignity. "I did not manipulate anyone," she said. "We met when I was a prisoner. He showed me kindness. We became friends. And then, more than friends. It is not a crime to fall in love." The officer had snorted. Love, how convenient. But she persisted. She collected letters from other prisoners who had known her at Camp Florence, testifying to her character. She obtained statements from the American doctor who had supervised her work in the infirmary, confirming her skills and dedication. She assembled a file thick with documentation, proving she was exactly what she claimed to be. A nurse, a decent person, someone who deserved a chance at a new life. Her parents struggled with the decision. Her mother wept when Annalise told them she wanted to leave Germany permanently. "You just came back to us," she said, "and now you want to leave again? For America? For one of them? Annalise sat with her mother and held her hands. Mama, I love him. I know it sounds impossible. I know it seems like betrayal. But Germany is broken. There is nothing here for me but rubble and grief. In America, I can have a future. I can build something new. Her father was more pragmatic. He looked at his daughter with sad, tired eyes. We have already lost your brother, he said quietly. Your sister is far away. If you stay here out of duty, you will resent us. You will grow bitter. That is no gift to us. Go to America, marry your soldier, be happy. That is what we want for you. The blessing, when it came, felt like absolution. Annalisa cried and promised to send money when she could, to write every week, to never forget where she came from. Her parents embraced her and told her they were proud. That took courage they hadn't known they possessed. The waiting was agonizing. Months stretched into seasons. Summer became fall. Fall became winter. The letters between Annalise and Jim were the only thing that kept hope alive. He wrote about the farm, about preparing a place for her. She wrote about her work at the hospital, about small improvements in Stuttgart, about her dreams of Kansas. They planned a future in careful detail, as if speaking it into existence might make it real. Finally, in November of 1946, the miracle happened. The War Brides Act was amended. German and Austrian women married to American servicemen would be allowed to immigrate under certain conditions. Additional screenings, additional interviews, but it was possible. Jim's lawyer called him with the news, and Jim immediately sent a telegram to Annalisa. It's happening. Start the final paperwork. We're going to do this. The last rounds of bureaucracy were exhausting. More interviews, more examinations. A final review by American consular officials who made it clear they were doing her a favor. You're lucky, one official told her. 6 months ago, this wouldn't have been possible. Don't make us regret it. She promised she wouldn't. In December of 1946, Annalisa boarded a ship in Bremen bound for New York. This time, she traveled as a free woman, not a prisoner, not cargo, a passenger with legal documents and a future waiting on the far shore. The crossing took 9 days through winter storms that tossed the ship like a toy. But Annalise didn't care. She stood on deck whenever the weather allowed, staring at the western horizon, watching for the first sign of land. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning mist, she wept. The last time she had seen that statue, she had been terrified, convinced she was sailing toward punishment and death. Now she was sailing toward love. The symmetry was almost too much to bear. Jim was waiting at the dock. She saw him before he saw her, standing in the crowd of people waiting for arrivals. He wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his face anxious. When their eyes met, his entire face transformed. He pushed through the crowd, and then she was in his arms, and nothing else mattered. They held each other while people flowed around them, while officials shouted instructions, while the world spun on. Finally, they were together. I can't believe you're real, Jim said, his voice choked. I was so afraid something would go wrong. I am real, Annalise said, laughing and crying at the same time. I am here. We are here. They were married 3 weeks later in Jim's hometown of Hays, Kansas. The wedding was small, held in the Lutheran church where Jim's family had worshipped for generations. Jim's parents had been shocked when he first told them about Annalise. His mother had cried. His father had been silent for a long time before, asking, Are you sure about this, son? Do you know what you're doing? Jim had been sure. And slowly, over phone calls and letters, his family had come around. When they met Annalisa in person, when they saw the way she and Jim looked at each other, the last resistance crumbled. She's good for him, Jim's mother admitted to her husband. I can see it. She makes him happy. But the town was less welcoming. News of the wedding spread quickly through Hays, and opinions were strong. Some people refused to attend. Others came only out of curiosity or a sense of obligation to Jim's family. Annalisa could feel the stares as she walked down the aisle, could hear the whispers. Nazi, traitor, how could he? But she held her head high. She wore a simple white dress that Jim's sister had helped her sew. She carried a small bouquet of winter flowers. And when she reached the altar and saw Jim waiting for her with tears in his eyes, none of the judgment mattered. The pastor performed the ceremony with dignity, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Jim kissed her like she was the only person in the world. The reception was awkward. Some guests made polite conversation, others avoided Annalisa entirely. One elderly woman approached her with a hard expression and said, "My son died at Normandy. He was 20 years old. How do you think I feel seeing you here?" Annalisa met her eyes steadily. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "Truly sorry. I also lost my brother in this war. I do not expect you to forgive me for being German, but I hope someday you can see that I am just a person trying to build a life, like your son wanted to do." The woman stared at her for a long moment, then walked away without another word. But later, Jim's mother told Annalise that the woman had said, "She has courage, at least." That's something. Building their life together required that courage every single day. Jim returned to farming, taking over part of his father's land. Annalise found work as a nurse at the county hospital. The pay was modest, but it was steady. They rented a small farmhouse on the edge of town and began the slow process of making it a home. Jim taught Annalisa how to drive a tractor, how to read the sky for weather, how to can vegetables for winter. She taught him German phrases, cooked meals from her childhood, shared stories about Stuttgart before the war. The community remained suspicious for a long time. Some stores refused to serve Annalise. Parents pulled their children away when she walked by. Anonymous letters arrived at their house calling Jim a traitor and Annalise much worse. It hurt, but they endured. They went to church every Sunday. They volunteered for community projects. They worked hard and kept to themselves when necessary. Slowly, grudgingly, acceptance came. It started with small things. A neighbor whose child Annalisa treated at the hospital thanked her genuinely. A farmer who worked alongside Jim admitted he was a good man, regardless of who he married. The local newspaper ran a story about the hospital staff, and Annalisa was included without comment on her nationality. Progress came in inches, but it came. In 1949, their first child was born. A daughter they named Ruth. She had Jim's hazel eyes and Annalisa's dark hair. Holding her for the first time, Annalisa felt something shift inside her. This child was proof that good could come from pain, that love could create life even after war had created so much death. Ruth was followed by two more children, a son named Thomas in 1951 and another daughter, Margaret, in 1954. The children grew up knowing both their heritages. They learned to speak some German. They heard stories about Stuttgart and Kansas, about a war that had tried to keep their parents apart but failed. By the 1960s, the Anderson family was simply part of Hayes. The suspicion had faded. Annalise was known as the nurse who never turned anyone away, who worked double shifts during flu season, who brought meals to elderly patients. Jim was respected as a fair dealer, a hard worker, a good neighbor. Their children excelled in school and played on sports teams and dated local kids. The past was still there, but it no longer defined them. As the decades passed, Annalise and Jim watched the world change around them. Germany rebuilt and became prosperous again. The Cold War turned former enemies into allies. Veterans from both sides grew old and began to see each other as men who had simply fought for their countries, not as monsters. Annalisa's parents eventually visited Kansas, a trip that took years to arrange but meant everything. Her father shook Jim's hand and said, "Thank you for loving my daughter, for giving her a home." Jim had replied simply, "She gave me a home too." In the 1980s, on a warm summer afternoon, Annalise and Jim sat on the porch of their farmhouse, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Ruth had become a teacher. Thomas had taken over the farm. Margaret had married a doctor and moved to Wichita. The grandchildren ran through the yard, chasing fireflies as the sun set over the Kansas plains. One of the grandchildren, a curious girl of about 10, climbed onto Annalisa's lap and asked, "Oma, is it true you were Grandpa's prisoner?" Annalisa smiled and stroked the girl's hair. "A long time ago, yes, during the war. I was a prisoner and he was a guard. How did you fall in love?" "Slowly," Annalisa said. "One kind word at a time, one conversation, one shared moment. Love doesn't care about borders or uniforms. It only cares about the heart." Jim reached over and took Annalise's hand. "We were lucky," he added. "Lucky that we saw each other as people first, not enemies, just people." The girl thought about this, then asked, "Were people mean to you?" "Sometimes," Annalise admitted. "People were afraid. They had lost so much in the war. They didn't understand how a German and an American could be together. But we showed them. By living well. By being kind. By raising a good family. Eventually, most people came around." Jim nodded. "And the ones who didn't, well, that was their loss, not ours." As the evening deepened and the grandchildren were called inside for bed, Annalise and Jim remained on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars emerge one by one. 40 years had passed since that first moment in the Arizona desert. 40 years of building a life together against all odds. "You ever regret it?" Jim asked quietly. "Coming here? Leaving Germany?" Annalise looked at him, her eyes soft. "Never," she said. "Not once. You gave me a future when I had none. You loved me when the world said you shouldn't. How could I regret that?" "I was the lucky one," Jim insisted. "You could have said no. You could have stayed safe in Germany. But you took a chance on me." "We took a chance on each other," Annalisa corrected, "and it was the best decision of my life." They sat together as the night grew cool, two people who had defied a war and won. Their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It was quieter than that. It was about kindness in a prison camp, letters across an ocean, bureaucratic persistence, a wedding in a skeptical town, hard work and patience, and love that refused to quit. In the end, their legacy was simple. They had proven that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion could survive, that love could bridge any divide, that enemies could become family. Their children and grandchildren carried that legacy forward, living proof that reconciliation was possible, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. As the stars wheeled overhead and the Kansas wind whispered through the wheat fields, Annalise and Jim sat together, living monuments to a truth the world needed desperately to remember. War divides, but love, patient and persistent and brave, can heal even the deepest wounds. And sometimes, just sometimes, a guard and his prisoner can become something the world never expected. Partners, equals, proof that hope against all odds endures.